You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on Beyond Measurements and Image. Today on the BMI podcast, we're going to talk about food sequencing. It's also known as ordered eating. What it is it's just the way in which we eat our macronutrients, right? The macronutrients being fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And so by ordered eating, it's just that. It's just the order in which you eat them. And the thought is if you eat them in a specific order, it may have some benefits. And particularly those benefits are it can manage your blood sugar and your insulin levels so that they don't spike as high, which then can lead to minimizing the amount of cravings that you have, particularly after you eat, and it can maximize satiety or the sensation of being full. How does it work? Well, it's a little bit complex, but let me describe it first just in what it is, and then we can kind of go a little bit into the science of it. So the thought is that if you can blunt your blood sugar from going too high too quickly, at least, after you eat, it's obviously going to rise. But if you can minimize it spiking, that does a couple things. When you minimize it spiking up, that also minimizes the amount of insulin that gets secreted. And remember, we've talked a million times about insulin, but as the blood sugar goes up, the insulin goes up. And if you just have chronic elevated insulin levels, you can become insulin resistant, which ultimately leads to your inability to break down fat, and you just have this sort of perpetual stimulus to store fat. And it minimizes your ability to then drive sugar into the cell. And when that happens, that causes more insulin to be secreted from the pancreas, which then just leads to higher insulin levels, and it's a vicious cycle. We know there's some things you can do, like, after you get done eating, if you get up and go for a walk, just a short walk, 10, 15 minutes, we know that blunts the sugar. Dr. Levine pointed that out in his book where he talks about non-exercise activity of thermogenesis, which we discussed in episode number 13. If you haven't listened to it, that's a great episode and a great topic, and I'd highly encourage you to go listen to it. But that's an example of something that we can do that helps to control our blood sugar. So let's just say you don't do ordered eating. You just eat whatever it is you're going to eat. And then instead of getting up and going in and sitting on the couch, or even getting up and going to do the dishes, if you just get up and go for a 10 or 15 minute walk just immediately after you eat, we see a significant attenuation in the spike in blood sugar. And when you decrease the spike in blood sugar, you consequently decrease the spike in insulin and all the benefits that come with that. So that's one example of something that you can do to control it. And it's interesting, I got one of those blood glucose monitors, and I wore it for a couple weeks. And I did different things like that. I ate, and then I didn't go walk, or I ate and I did go walk. And it was really fascinating to watch. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. If you eat, doesn't matter what you eat really, when you eat and you go for a walk, your blood sugar just doesn't go as high. So with ordered eating, that's kind of one of the goals, right, is to help manage that blood sugar to keep it from spiking. Because we know that when it spikes, not only do you have the consequences of insulin that we just talked about, but when it spikes, it also then has to crash. And when it crashes, that sends a signal to your brain that you're hungry, which then gets you right back into the kitchen or the pantry and you start eating again. And that's why simple carbs can be so dangerous, is because it does rocket your blood sugar and then it crashes down. And when that happens, you just take in more calories. And with the excess calorie intake, of course, that just leads to weight gain and all of the effects of hyperinsulinemia. Food sequencing, what is it? Well, it's a matter of how you go about eating. So there's sort of two schools of thought on this, but they're kind of generally the same. The overarching idea is that you eat carbohydrates last. So the first approach is that you eat sort of fiber first, right? You eat things that have lots of fiber in them, such as vegetables or even a salad. And what that does is that sort of creates what they refer to as a food net. And fiber, we know, slows the gastric emptying to some extent, and it also blunts blood sugar spikes. So if you drink a Coke, right, that's just pure sugar, there's no fiber in it, your blood sugar will just go sky high. But if you eat a peach, it has quite a bit of fiber in it. It's what you would call a complex carbohydrate. It has fiber associated with it. So even though that also is a sugar, it empties out of the stomach a little slower, which then causes the blood sugar to go up a little slower and not quite as high, and it just sustains at that level instead of spiking up and down. So by eating fiber first in your meal, that basically is a way of just saying like eating vegetables first, then you get that fiber in your belly first. And yes, those are carbohydrates. Almost all vegetables are carbohydrates, but they're complex carbohydrates. They're associated with a fiber. So you eat that, and then you eat your proteins, right? Your steak, your fish, chicken, turkey, and then you have your carbs. So like an example of that would be maybe for your first course, so to speak, you'd have a salad, and then you would have your entree, and then you would have your carbohydrate. And by carbohydrate at that point, what I'm talking about is bread, pasta, rice, maybe your desserts, fruits, things that are just more carby, so to speak. So that's one way of doing it. Now, another way that they looked at it scientifically was they looked at just preloading your protein first. And what that means is that you just ate protein first. And so they looked at the combination of doing fiber first and then protein and then your carbohydrates, or just protein and then your carbohydrates. The study where they looked at protein and carbohydrates, they see the same thing, that when you do that, when you eat them in that order, you get a blunting of the postprandial blood sugar, which really has significant benefits. But when you blunt that, you also blunt the insulin levels going up. You also blunt the fact that is not going to crash, so you don't have cravings shortly thereafter. And whether you eat vegetables and fiber first and then protein, or you just eat protein alone before carbohydrates, both of those are associated with an increase in satiety, where patients that were studied in these were asked, how full do you feel? Do you feel like you had enough to eat? Both of them, both arms of that, fiber first, then protein, then carbohydrate, or just protein and then carbohydrate. Both groups said that they felt more full when they ate in that order. And when they look at the postprandial blood sugars, they notice across the board that those are all attenuated. They're all brought down by eating in this ordered sequence. So other than just slowing the gut down by having fiber and protein in, which we know those do tend to cause a slower gastric emptying, other than just slowing it down, is there anything else that goes on? Well, in fact, it does look like that if you preload your protein, at least, if you eat your protein first, it does show that the incretins, right, particularly GLP-1 and GIP, tend to go up. Now, interestingly, GLP-1, remember, is the glucose-like polypeptide. And there's actually at least two of them, right? So GLP-1, when you hear that, you think about the drug, but it's actually a incretin that's secreted from the L cells of the small bowel. So remember, GLP-1, the hormone, helps to regulate blood sugar as well. And it does this also by stimulating insulin release, and then it also suppresses glucagon. Remember, glucagon is the opposite of insulin. So if insulin drives blood sugar down, glucagon drives blood sugar up. But GLP-1 also decreases or slows gastric emptying, which in turn increases your satiety. So if you eat things that are going to slow your stomach from emptying and make you feel full quicker, you're much more likely to eat less. That's true of proteins, and that's true of fiber, then protein, and then carbohydrates, both ways. But it's not just the mechanical presence of food products that are digested more slowly. It's actually also associated with the release of GLP-1, which works in the hypothalamus, which helps to slow gastric emptying and increase satiety. But interestingly, when you preload your protein, it also increases GIP-1. So GIP-1, it actually has two names. Originally, it was called gastric inhibitory polypeptide, and that was thought that it was just a major role was to decrease gastric acid production. But now it's known as glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. So it's the same thing. It's the exact same hormone, and it's secreted from the K cells, which is a little bit different than the GLP-1, which is secreted from the L cells. But GIP-1 stimulates insulin secretion as well, but it does it in a glucose-dependent manner. So in other words, the more glucose, it's sort of regulated a little more tightly as opposed to just a secretion of insulin from the beta cells. It's just regulated a little more closely. But interestingly, GIP also can stimulate glucagon secretion at low blood sugar. So if you have low blood sugar, right, the last thing you want is to have something that's going to keep your body from breaking down your stored sugars. Remember, your stored sugars are glycogen, primarily seen in your liver and your muscle cells. GLP-1 does not allow you to stimulate glucagon, which would then help to raise your blood sugar, but GIP does allow you to do that. But it also promotes the storage of fat, kind of like insulin, but in a different way. So you think, well, gosh, do we really want something that increases the storage of fat? And the answer is, probably not. But GIP-1 is very short acting, and it works quite well in this situation. So it may actually help to promote weight loss, at least in combination with GLP-1. And when you combine those two, when you combine GLP-1 and GIP, if you were to combine that into a drug, that's what you have in Mounjaro. That's what Mounjaro is. It's not just a GLP-1. It's a GLP-1 and a GIP. But what's interesting is if you preload your diet with fish, that increases GLP-1 and that increases GIP, but to a little bit lesser extent. But if you preload your diet with steak or something that's more saturated fat, you increase your GLP-1 and your GIP both at an equal amount. And so the thought is that maybe by preloading with fish and by having a lower spike in GIP, you might actually do yourself a little bit of a favor in terms of not creating a fat-storing molecule to go then and store that. When you look at the science, it doesn't seem like it has a huge effect on it. And to be honest with you, the GIP and actually native GLP-1 are extremely short-acting. But the point of going into all that, and I don't expect you to remember any of that, but the point of all of that is just simply that it's not just a matter of eating in a certain order to get the benefits that mechanically arise from eating that way, although there is a huge benefit to that. But it also actually works hormonally by these cells in the gut, which then in turn work in the brain. Again, if you haven't listened to the podcast on GLP-1, I would strongly encourage you to go listen to that one. That was one of the early ones, and that is episode 5. It just talks about how they work, and it does get a little bit into the weeds, but if you haven't listened to it or if you haven't listened to it for a while, it might be worth going back to listen to kind of help understand it. But the reality of it is, if you don't care about that, if you don't care about the mechanism of action, that's fine as well, right? If you're just trying to figure out what's the best way to manage your diet, to lose weight, this is yet another arrow in your quiver that you can use to help manage your blood sugar, which, you think, well, gosh, is blood sugar the problem, or is it the weight? Is it, just the weight? When I stand on the scale, it doesn't measure my blood sugar, so why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you have these big ebbs and flows in your blood sugar and you have these cravings and you go eat, then you take in more calories. And if you take in more calories than you burn, that's how you end up putting on weight. Also, there's the benefit of eating things that don't spike your blood sugar and don't spike and hold your insulin levels up high. That's basically what I have on ordered eating or food sequencing. I think it's a great tool that you might want to employ, right? The nice thing is, on the BMI podcast, we've talked about multiple different ways to manage your weight. And so there's a whole host of different diets that we've discussed, and we've talked about the different medications, and we've talked about intermittent fasting, and it goes on and on. But you don't just necessarily have to pick one, right? Maybe the combination of all of these things is key, but I don't necessarily think that you would want to, pick 2 or 3 and try to implement them all at the same time. Maybe you implement food sequencing first, right? It seems like a relatively simple thing. You're not denying yourself anything. There's no restriction to this. It's just you're restricted, I guess, in the order that you take it in. But let's say you do that for a while and you see the benefit and you're able to adapt it. It does look like in the studies that they've done, there was a big study out of Japan, and they looked at compliance. And compliance was pretty high, right? People were able to stick with this because they weren't restricting anything that they were eating. And interestingly, when you look over time at the 5-year mark, the people who did participate in food sequencing actually had lower hemoglobin A1Cs. They had lower systolic and diastolic blood pressures. Their BMI was a little bit lower. It's interesting. Part of their lipid profile was improved and part of it was not. So maybe implementing food sequencing as step 1. And then maybe to build on that, maybe you implement a particular diet. Let's just say you choose the Mediterranean diet. So you do food sequencing with the Mediterranean diet, and then maybe over time you add in intermittent fasting. right? Either the 16-8 or the 5-2. And I'd like to go back and compare those maybe in the next podcast and just discuss the benefits of each and which one maybe has better outcomes. But maybe if you build these things, then you can begin to make these changes that you need to make that not only will help you lose weight on the scale, but also just lead a healthier life. Hopefully you found this interesting. If you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up on any of our social media platforms. That's all I have for this. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time on the BMI Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.